Summer nights in Asheville, North Carolina were usually quiet. Families sat on porches. Kids rode bikes in fading light. And nothing ever seemed out of place. But on June 22nd, 1991, the calm of this mountain town was shattered. A 16-year-old high school student vanished on her way home, and the case would haunt Asheville for the next 2 decades. That evening, Emily Carter attended a summer basketball game at her school gym. It wasn't a big event, just students, parents, and neighbors. By 9:30 p.m., the game was over. The crowd was leaving, and the chatter of the night spilled into the parking lot. Emily said goodbye to her friends, adjusted her backpack, and started walking toward home. The route was short, 10 minutes at most, through a familiar stretch of cracked pavement and an empty lot that bordered the church grounds. She had walked that path countless times. No one worried when she set off alone. But Emily never came back. By 10 p.m., her parents grew uneasy. She had promised to be home right after the game. When she didn't appear, her father got into his truck and drove the streets between the school and their house. He circled twice, then 3 times. Nothing. Her mother called friends, teachers, neighbors. No one had seen her. Panic set in quickly. This wasn't like Emily. She was reliable, careful, and always home on time. Around 10:20 p.m., a neighbor reported hearing a short, sharp scream near the edge of the church lot. When he looked outside, he saw nothing but shadows. Minutes later, Emily's sneakers were found near a fence. One lying on its side, the other pressed against the grass as if it had been kicked off. Her corsage from the evening lay crushed beside them. Beyond that, there were no tire tracks. No drag marks. No sign of a struggle. By midnight, search teams with flashlights scoured the neighborhood. Officers swept the wooded area behind the school. Volunteers walked shoulder to shoulder across fields, calling her name. A K-9 unit picked up her scent but lost it near the church parking lot. Hours turned into dawn. Emily Carter was 16 years old in the summer of 1991. She lived with her parents and her older brother Michael in a modest home on the outskirts of Asheville, North Carolina. Their street was lined with small houses, neat yards, and families who had known each other for years. The Carters fit in perfectly. They were respected, dependable, and active in both school and church. Emily was a junior at Asheville High School. She wasn't the kind of student who sought attention, but everyone knew her name. She was on the cheerleading team, often standing courtside at basketball games with a wide smile. On Sundays, she played violin in the church youth orchestra. Teachers called her polite, steady, and dependable, never late, never careless. Friends described her as outgoing, but not reckless. She had a wide circle of people around her, moving easily between different groups at school. She was the kind of person classmates turned to for advice or homework help, and she never refused. Emily wasn't a top athlete or the #1 student in her class, but she was the kind of teenager everyone quietly admired. Reliable, friendly, kind. The Carter family carried the same reputation. Her mother, Diane, worked part-time at the town library and was deeply involved in church activities. Her father, Robert, owned a small auto shop and often volunteered to coach Little League teams. Their home was open, welcoming, and often full of Emily's friends. For many kids, the Carter house was the safe place to gather after school. But Emily's personal life was not without complications. For much of the previous year, she had dated Brian Collins, a 17-year-old basketball player. Brian was popular but volatile. Friends had seen the two argue in the school parking lot more than once. After the breakup, the tension didn't go away. Several classmates recalled Brian making threats, telling Emily he would never let her go. Teachers noticed the strain, but back then it was dismissed as teenage drama. In early 1991, Emily had started talking to someone new, a boy from a nearby high school. It was casual, still in the early stages, but it gave her a sense of moving forward. To her friends, it looked like she was leaving the turbulence with Brian behind. One detail stood out about Emily more. Outside of school and relationships, Emily's life was routine. She was preparing for her senior year, already talking about applying to colleges. She had a part-time babysitting job for neighbors a few houses away. And she often walked to and from school, a habit that felt safe in a town like Asheville in the early 90s. Nobody thought twice about it. That was what made her disappearance so devastating. She wasn't the kind of teenager who drifted away from home, or someone expected to vanish into the night. She represented the image of an ordinary girl in a safe town, the daughter of a mechanic and a librarian, a cheerleader, a violinist, a babysitter, a friend. Her sudden absence cracked the foundation of Asheville's sense of security. For the Carter family, it was unimaginable. They had done everything right. A stable home, community ties, faith, and structure. Yet within minutes, all of that stability collapsed. Emily's life showed no warning signs that she might walk away voluntarily. There were no packed bags, no secret plans, no trail of money or belongings missing. She was simply gone. Her friends remembered the last time they saw her, June 22, 1991. It was a Saturday evening after a summer basketball game at the high school gym. Emily had her violin case with her, still wearing the silver necklace. She told her friends she was walking home. It was a path she had taken countless times, just 10 minutes down a familiar road. There was nothing unusual about it. But that walk would never be completed. By 10 o'clock, when she failed to arrive home, her parents knew something was wrong. They went out searching themselves. Half an hour later, they found one of her sneakers near a fence line. A few neighbors said they had heard a short scream but couldn't see anyone. No car was identified. No clear witness emerged. The absence of answers turned a family's life upside down and sent an entire community spiraling into fear and suspicion. Emily Carter's background is critical to understanding the case. She wasn't a troubled teen or a runaway. She wasn't in hiding. She was a 16-year-old girl, rooted in her family, her school, her church, and her community. On the evening of June 22, 1991, Asheville High School hosted a summer basketball game. Families filled the gym, the band played, and the cheerleaders kept the energy alive. Among them was Emily Carter, wearing her uniform, smiling with her friends, and carrying her violin case from earlier practice at the church. The game ended around 9:20 p.m. As parents gathered their children and the crowd poured into the warm summer night, Emily told her friends she would walk home. Her house was barely a 10-minute walk from the school. To save time, she usually cut across an open lot and slipped through a broken fence before reaching her street. It wasn't lit, but in a town like Asheville in the early 1990s, few thought of danger. That night, she followed the same route she had taken dozens of times before. At 9:30 p.m., Emily left the school grounds, heading into the darkness, alone. That was the last confirmed sighting of her alive. Some friends thought it was strange for her to walk by herself so late, but no one followed. The assumption was simple. Emily knew the path, and she would be home in minutes. The community saw their town as safe, and no one expected what was about to happen. By 10 p.m., Diane and Robert Carter grew uneasy. Emily was never this late without calling. Her father drove the short route toward the school while her mother phoned neighbors and Emily's closest friends. No one had seen her. Robert circled back home with no sign of his daughter. At 10:15, they decided something was very wrong. By 10:30, they contacted the police. For a teenager reported missing so quickly, it was an unusual step. But the Carters knew their daughter, and this was not her choice. Police joined the search within the hour. Flashlights swept the dark paths leading away from the high school. Around the broken fence line near the vacant lot, they found the first clue. Lying in the grass was one of Emily's white Nike sneakers. The sole was smeared with mud, consistent with the damp earth nearby. A few feet away, there was a shallow depression in the grass, as if someone had been pushed or pulled down. It wasn't conclusive, but it suggested a struggle. Back at the Carter home, detectives checked Emily's room. Her purse, her school bag, and her money were all untouched. The silver necklace engraved with her initials, a gift from her mother for her 16th birthday, was missing. Diane confirmed Emily wore it every day. It was the only item unaccounted for. By sunrise, there was still no trace. The following morning, local newspapers ran the headline, "Asheville Teen Missing After Basketball Game." The community mobilized. Volunteers searched fields, wooded trails, and abandoned buildings. Flyers with Emily's school portrait appeared on storefronts and telephone poles. The case spread quickly across town. The circumstances were chilling. Emily had vanished in less than 15 minutes, between leaving the gym and failing to arrive home. The route was familiar, the distance short, the night crowded with people returning from the game. Yet no one witnessed what happened. The missing shoe and the faint sign of a struggle gave police their only physical leads. The neighbor's statement about a scream gave them a time, but there were no fingerprints, no tire tracks, no description of a vehicle, and no one saw Emily being taken. Rumors spread almost instantly. Many pointed to her ex-boyfriend, Brian Collins. Others whispered about Tommy Reed, the reclusive neighbor with a minor criminal record. Both young men lived under the weight of suspicion from the earliest days of the case. But in those first crucial hours, the focus was on finding Emily alive. Search lines stretched for miles, combing through woods and creeks. Helicopters circled overhead. By the third day, police admitted they had no solid direction. The trail had gone cold almost as soon as it began. Investigators reconstructed the timeline. At 9:20, the game ended. At 9:30, Emily left the school. By 9:45, a scream was heard. At 10 o'clock, her parents grew concerned. By 10:15, they were on the road searching. At 10:30, police were notified. In that 20-minute window, Emily vanished from a well-traveled path in the heart of her. Inside the Carter household, the absence of the necklace weighed heavily. Diane had given it to her daughter just months earlier. Emily never took it off. Its disappearance meant someone had taken it with her. Whether it was ripped away during a fight or kept as a souvenir, detectives couldn't say. But the missing necklace would become one of the most important details in the years to come. By the end of that first week, frustration grew. More than 100 people had been questioned, from classmates to parents at the game. No one offered a breakthrough. Without a body, a suspect, or a confession, the case quickly reached a standstill. But in the first days, before suspicion narrowed, the entire focus was on one unanswered question. How could a 16-year-old girl vanish in the middle of a summer night, surrounded by neighbors, friends, and family? The case had begun with urgency, but soon it became a mystery that defied explanation. The path was short, the window of time was tight, yet Emily was gone. And as the search slowed, one detail lingered over the entire town: the scent trail stopping at the back lot of St. Mary's Church. It was a lead no one could explain, and it would echo in every discussion of the case for decades to come. The night of June 22, 1991, Asheville police moved quickly. Within an hour of the first call, officers and volunteers were on the ground with flashlights, combing through the vacant lot, the patch of woods, and the small creek behind the high school. Parents, teachers, and neighbors joined in. Dozens of people fanned out, calling Emily's name into the darkness. The only physical clue was her left Nike sneaker lying near the fence. There were no fresh tire marks, no discarded belongings, nothing else that explained what had happened. By midnight, the search expanded. Canine units were brought in. One dog picked up Emily's scent from the spot where the shoe was found. The trail followed the narrow path she always took home. Then it stopped cold in the parking lot behind St. Mary's Church. Handlers tried again, circling the lot, searching nearby. The scent ended the same way every time. Investigators wrote, by sunrise, the working theory became abduction. Officers pointed to 3 pieces of evidence: the single shoe near the fence, the neighbor who reported hearing a short scream around 9:45 p.m., and the dog's scent stopping in the church lot. All 3 pointed to someone intercepting Emily on her walk home. But the trail ended there. Detectives returned to the high school and began interviews. More than 100 students, parents, and staff had been at the game. Many remembered seeing Emily in her cheer uniform, carrying her violin case. None remembered her leaving with anyone. No one reported a suspicious car waiting nearby. It was as if she had stepped into the darkness and disappeared. The one neighbor's account became a central lead. He told officers he had been sitting on his porch when he heard a sudden scream. It lasted only a second, sharp enough to draw his attention. He looked out across the field but saw nothing in the shadows. The detail was troubling: a scream without a source, and then silence. News spread the following morning. Local papers ran the headline: Asheville teen missing after basketball game. Television cameras gathered outside the Carter home. The story described Emily as an ordinary girl who vanished on an ordinary road. The community's sense of safety cracked overnight. Parents stopped letting their children walk home after dark. Small-town trust gave way to whispers and suspicion. By the second day, the focus turned toward Emily's former boyfriend, Brian Collins. 17 years old, a star on the basketball team, but known for his temper. Friends told detectives about heated arguments in the school parking lot before the breakup. Some said Brian had told Emily he would never let her go. Investigators pressed him for his movements that night. He claimed he was at a friend's house. That friend could not confirm the exact time he arrived. His alibi was shaky. Rumors spread quickly, and by the end of the week, Brian's name was on everyone's lips. But Brian was not the only suspect. Another man's name surfaced: Tommy Reed, a 20-year-old who lived 2 houses down from the Carters. Unemployed with a minor record for shoplifting. On the evening of June 22, 1991, Asheville High School hosted a summer basketball game. Families filled the gym, the band played, and the cheerleaders kept the energy alive. Among them was Emily Carter, wearing her uniform, smiling with her friends, and carrying her violin case from earlier practice at the church. The game ended around 9:20 p.m. As parents gathered their children and the crowd poured into the warm summer night, Emily told her friends she would walk home. Her house was barely a 10-minute walk from the school. To save time, she usually cut across an open lot and slipped through a broken fence before reaching her street. It wasn't lit, but in a town like Asheville in the early 1990s, few thought of danger. That night, she followed the same route she had taken dozens of times before. At 9:30 p.m., Emily left the school grounds, heading into the darkness, alone. That was the last confirmed sighting of her alive. Some friends thought it was strange for her to walk by herself so late, but no one followed. The assumption was simple. Emily knew the path, and she would be home in minutes. The community saw their town as safe, and no one expected what was about to happen. By 10 p.m., Diane and Robert Carter grew uneasy. Emily was never this late without calling. Her father drove the short route toward the school while her mother phoned neighbors and Emily's closest friends. No one had seen her. Robert circled back home with no sign of his daughter. At 10:15, they decided something was very wrong. By 10:30, they contacted the police. For a teenager reported missing so quickly, it was an unusual step. But the Carters knew their daughter, and this was not her choice. Police joined the search within the hour. Flashlights swept the dark paths leading away from the high school. Around the broken fence line near the vacant lot, they found the first clue. Lying in the grass was one of Emily's white Nike sneakers. The sole was smeared with mud, consistent with the damp earth nearby. A few feet away, there was a shallow depression in the grass, as if someone had been pushed or pulled down. It wasn't conclusive, but it suggested a struggle. From the very first night, investigators had two names that stood out. Both were close to Emily, both carried troubled reputations, and both quickly became the center of Asheville's suspicions. The first was Brian Collins. 17 years old in 1991, he was a star on the high school basketball team. Tall, athletic, known around the gym. But off the court, he had a temper. Teachers remembered breaking up fights involving Brian more than once. Friends said he could be charming one moment and explosive the next. Brian had dated Emily for several months. Their relationship ended only weeks before her disappearance. Friends described their breakup as loud, public, and filled with arguments. More than once, classmates heard Brian tell Emily he would never let her go. The words, once brushed off as the anger of a teenage boyfriend, took on a darker meaning after she vanished. On the night of June 22nd, Brian claimed he was at a friend's house across town. He said he arrived there shortly after the basketball game and stayed most of the evening. But the timeline didn't match up. Investigators pressed him for details: when exactly he left the gym, what route he took, who saw him arrive. His answers shifted. The friend he mentioned couldn't confirm the exact time Brian showed up. No one else could verify his story. To detectives, it looked like an alibi with holes. The rumor mill made things worse. Students began whispering that Brian had been seen near the parking lot after the game. Others swore they saw him pacing by the school fence. None of these claims were ever confirmed, but they spread fast. The local paper painted him as the angry ex-boyfriend, the obvious suspect. Within days, Asheville residents were convinced Brian had something to do with Emily's disappearance. He was just 17, but he was already under the weight of being labeled a killer. Then there was Tommy Reed. 20 years old at the time, Tommy lived 2 doors down from the Carter family. He had grown up in the same neighborhood but never fit in. He had dropped out of school, drifted between part-time jobs, and carried a minor record for shoplifting. Nothing violent, but enough to keep him on the radar of police. Neighbors said Tommy often kept to himself. Some thought he was odd. Others claimed he lingered too much around Emily, making her uncomfortable. There was no proof, only gossip. But in a town desperate for answers, gossip became suspicion. When detectives questioned Tommy, he said he had been home alone the entire evening. He couldn't provide a single person to back him up. His lack of alibi put him in the same position as Brian, someone with motive, opportunity, and no one to vouch for his innocence. The town began to split in two. Half believed Brian killed Emily in a fit of rage, unable to accept the breakup. They pointed to his history of fights, his temper, and his own words. The other half looked at Tommy Reed, the strange neighbor with no job, no prospects, and a record. They argued that he had always been the more dangerous one, the man living right under the Carter family's nose. This divide ran deep. In grocery stores, at church, on the streets, people whispered their theories. Some refused to let their children walk near the Collins house. Others crossed the street to avoid Tommy. Both young men were trapped under suspicion. For police, the problem was simple. There was no evidence. No fingerprints, no blood. No DNA that could be tested with the technology of the time. The shoe left near the fence carried no usable clues. The slight depression in the grass could not prove a struggle. The one witness who heard a scream saw nothing else. The case was filled with shadows, but no substance. Investigators grilled Brian repeatedly. They asked him to take a polygraph. The results were inconclusive. They searched his car, his room, his belongings. Nothing tied him to Emily's disappearance. Still, the pressure on him grew. At school, students called him a murderer. His chances of playing college basketball disappeared as recruiters backed away. He was never charged, but he carried the stigma of guilt. Tommy's life collapsed as well. Already struggling to find work, he now had to answer every employer's unspoken question. Was he the man who took Emily Carter? Neighbors avoided him. Parents told their children not to speak to him. He became the second shadow suspect. Never indicted, never convicted, but never free of suspicion. For the Carter family, it was torture. They knew Brian. He had eaten dinner at their table. They knew Tommy. He had waved from his porch. The idea that either of them could have taken Emily was unbearable. Yet the police offered no other explanation. The family watched as the investigation narrowed to two suspects, and then stalled. Meanwhile, the Carter family carried their own burden. They endured the whispers, the sideways glances, the constant questions about Brian and Tommy. But most of all, they lived with the absence of their daughter and sister. Every day they looked out the window, hoping for news that never came. The police insisted they had done everything possible, but without evidence, they could not charge anyone. Without charges, the case could not move to trial. Without trial, the truth remained buried. The 1990s passed with no breakthroughs. The case was mentioned in the local paper every anniversary. Vigils were held at the school gym. Ribbons were tied around trees. Yet the investigation itself was frozen in time. Brian Collins and Tommy Reed became unwilling fixtures of the case. Their names appeared in every article, every discussion. There were the suspects of Asheville, not because of proof, but because there was no one else. And so the story hardened. Two young men under suspicion. One family desperate for answers. a town divided, waiting for a truth that never came. By the mid-1990s, the file labeled the Asheville Mystery sat in the cold case cabinet, gathering dust. Officially, the police had no suspect they could charge. Unofficially, everyone in Asheville had already chosen who they believed. For Brian, the angry ex-boyfriend, and Tommy, the troubled neighbor, the shadows of that summer night in 1991 followed them for the rest of their lives. With no new evidence, the case stalled. The Carter family's hope dimmed but never died. The community learned to live with unanswered questions, and the name of Emily Carter lingered in every conversation, every whisper, every doubt. By the end of that decade, her disappearance had joined the growing shelf of unsolved cases in North Carolina, and Asheville would carry its silence for decades. In the summer of 1991, Asheville was shaken by the sudden disappearance of Emily Carter. For weeks, the town searched. For months, detectives chased every lead. But by the end of the year, the case had reached a dead end. The file was marked open, but inside the Carter household, the weight never lifted. Robert and Diane Carter kept the porch light on night after night, a beacon in case their daughter somehow found her way back. Diane wrote letters to the police chief every year, urging them not to close the file. Michael, Emily's older brother, grew into adulthood with constant reminders of the sister who was missing. He appeared on talk shows, in news interviews, always carrying the same question: why no answers? Meanwhile, suspicion poisoned the lives of the two men who had been named as early suspects. Brian Collins, Emily's ex-boyfriend, never recovered from the cloud over his head. He lost his shot at a college basketball career. Every job interview ended with the same unspoken question: wasn't he the one who killed her? Neighbors whispered, strangers pointed. He carried the mark of a crime he did not commit. Tommy Reed, the 20-year-old neighbor labeled strange by the community, lived even more isolated. He had a history of petty theft, and that was enough for some to brand him dangerous. Parents told their children not to go near his house. Store owners refused to hire him. For nearly 25 years, he walked the streets of Asheville as a man half accused, half forgotten. Detectives admitted frustration. The case file swelled to more than 3,000 pages, but without physical evidence, it was little more than paperwork. Canine units had traced her scent to the back lot of St. Mary's Church on the night she vanished, but nothing else had surfaced. DNA technology in the 1990s required clean, abundant samples, and what they had, the muddy shoe, scraps of fabric, was too degraded to process. Everything was boxed, sealed, and locked in evidence storage. The community adjusted to living with uncertainty. Parents no longer let their children walk home alone after dusk. Teachers reminded students to travel in groups. The lesson was simple. If Emily could vanish on a 10-minute walk in a safe neighborhood, anyone could. Television stations produced documentaries. Local reporters revisited the case in countless segments. In 1998, a crime magazine dubbed it. By the late 2000s, the Asheville Police Department made it official. Emily Carter's file was a cold case. Investigators would only reopen it if new evidence emerged. But no evidence ever came. For the Carter family, each passing year meant another vigil, another unanswered prayer, another birthday marked without Emily. The town of Asheville carried the silence. What began as a search for a missing teenager had hardened into a decades-long wound. Many believed the truth had been buried forever. But in 2015, silence cracked. At St. Mary's Church, workers cleaning out an old storage room uncovered a small wooden box hidden beneath years of dust. Inside lay a silver necklace engraved with two simple letters, E.C., and a handful of faded Polaroid photographs. The case seemed frozen in time, a wound Asheville carried for more than 2 decades. But in 2015, a single discovery inside an old church storage room shattered that silence. What was hidden there would finally reopen the case of Emily Carter. If you want to know what they found and how it changed everything, don't miss the next part of this story. Before we continue, let me know your thoughts. Do you believe the real killer was hiding in plain sight all along? Drop a comment, share this video, and make sure you're subscribed with notifications on, so you don't miss the shocking breakthrough. In the summer of 2015, a renovation project at St. Mary's Church in Asheville led workers into a forgotten corner of the property. A storage room, sealed for decades, was finally unlocked. Dust covered every surface. Old papers, broken furniture, and wooden crates had been left untouched since the early 90s. As volunteers cleared the space, one small wooden box caught their attention. Its lock was rusted, its hinges stiff. When they pried it open, they expected only more discarded documents. Instead, inside the box were items that would rewrite a mystery that had haunted the town for 24 years. At the very top lay a silver necklace with the initials E.C. etched into the charm. The Carter family. By 2015, DNA technology had advanced far beyond what was possible in 1991. Even the smallest trace could now be analyzed. Technicians carefully examined the silver chain. On its clasp and along the charm they found microscopic biological material. The results stunned everyone. The DNA belonged to a man. It was not Emily's. Police compared it against profiles from the original suspects. Brian Collins, Emily's ex-boyfriend, had long been considered the prime suspect. His DNA did not match. Tommy Reed, the neighbor branded as strange and dangerous, was also tested. Again, no match. For the first time in nearly 25 years, the investigation shifted away from Brian and Tommy. The two men who had lived under suspicion, their lives ruined by rumor and fear, were cleared in a single lab report. The discovery of the necklace was more than evidence. It was proof that the wrong men had been shadowed for decades. And it pointed to a new, more disturbing question. Why had Emily's necklace and photographs of the crime scene been hidden inside a church? Detectives reopened the case. They combed through records of St. Mary's Church from 1991. Who had keys to the storage rooms? Who had unrestricted access at the time of Emily's disappearance? The list was short. Only a handful of staff members and one man stood above them all. Pastor Richard Hale. For decades, Hale had been the face of trust in Asheville. He officiated weddings, funerals, and baptisms. He visited hospitals, counseled families, and delivered sermons that filled the pews. No one had ever questioned him. He was the very image of morality in the community. But the evidence suggested otherwise. He had both access and opportunity. And now, for the first time, the investigation's focus moved toward a man no one had dared to suspect. When news broke of the discovery, Asheville reeled. Families who had whispered for years about Brian or Tommy suddenly realized they might have condemned two innocent men. The town's collective guilt turned into shock. If the pastor was involved, it meant the truth had been hidden in plain sight. The Carter family was informed immediately. After nearly 25 years, Diane and Robert Carter finally felt a glimmer of hope. At a press conference, Diane spoke through tears. "For all these years, we've asked for answers. Maybe this time, we'll finally bring Emily home." Reporters across the country picked up the story. Headlines read, "Cold Case Breakthrough, Necklace May Unlock Asheville Mystery." National networks highlighted the case that had once been considered unsolvable. The investigation was no longer a closed chapter in a small town's history. It was now a national story, with one central figure, Pastor Richard Hale. Every piece of evidence, every lead, and every new question pointed in his direction. For the community, the possibility was almost too much to accept. The man they trusted most, the one who had led vigils and prayers for Emily for years, was suddenly at the center of the case. Parents who once told their children to look up to him now asked how such a betrayal could have been hidden for so long. The Carter family prepared themselves for what might come next. They had spent nearly half their lives waiting, trapped in silence and grief. Now the truth seemed closer than ever. DNA had cleared the men who carried suspicion for decades, and every sign pointed to one man, Pastor Richard Hale. The shocking truth about that night was about to come out. September 2015. The lab report lands on the detective's desk with a single clear line at the top. The DNA on Emily Carter's silver necklace matches Richard Hale. Not partial, not probable. A full profile. The analyst signs off on contamination controls and chain of custody checks. The profile is compared against the state database and a fresh buccal swab from Hale. It's a perfect match. After 24 years of rumor and guesswork, science gives a name. Detectives move fast. They draft affidavits, lay out the necklace images, the Polaroids of the path, the K-9 report from 1991 that died at the St. Mary's parking lot, and the inventory from the storage room. A judge signs the arrest and search. At the station, he asks for an attorney, but also wants to talk. He says he kept a box for the church years ago. He says the box could have been moved by anyone. He says he never knew Emily personally. Detectives press play on a recording, the lab analyst explaining the match, the controls, the statistics that make coincidence impossible. They slide photos across the table. The necklace marked EC, the wooden box, the Polaroids of the path where Emily disappeared. They open a binder to a page from 1991. The K-9 handler's note. Sent lost near St. Mary's rear lot. He holds the photos. He shakes his head. He repeats that this is a misunderstanding. Hours pass. His attorney arrives. They request a break. Detectives leave the room and return with a simple timeline. June 22nd, 1991, 9:30 p.m. Emily leaves the basketball game. 9:45 p.m. A neighbor hears a short, sharp scream. Minutes later, the scent trail ends in the church parking lot. The storage room is under Hale's control. The box is found there. The necklace carries his DNA. The wall cracks on one question. Why is your DNA on the inside clasp of her necklace? Not on the outside, where many hands might touch. On the clasp that sits against the neck. He has no answer. Silence stretches. The attorney lowers his eyes. The detective does not raise his voice. He lays down a final photo, the inside of the clasp swab area, tagged and logged. The chain creaks in Hale's grip. He starts to talk. It comes out flat and slow. He says he saw a girl walking alone near the school that night. He pulled over. He offered a ride. She refused. He persisted. He reached for her arm. She fought, loud and fast. He says he meant to comb her, that he covered her mouth and dragged her toward the car. He uses the word panic. He uses the word accident. He will not say murder. He says it happened quickly. He says the community's trust in institutions buckles. Parish leaders suspend Hale and issue a statement promising full cooperation. They open counseling hours. They review key control policies and evidence storage practices. Even though they never imagined their church would hold evidence in a homicide. People ask a brutal question. How did a man with that much access avoid scrutiny? The answer hurts. Tunnel vision, limited forensics in 1991, and the bias that a respected pastor could not be a predator. For the Carter family, the call about the remains is a cut that finally defines the wound. Detectives sit in their living room and say the words out loud. The parents close their eyes. Michael Carter says later, "We lived in his shadow, never knowing the truth." They identify the necklace from new photographs and sign for the release of their daughter's remains when the lab work concludes. The room with Emily's posters and violin case will not change, but the question that haunted it now has an answer. Prosecutors meet with detectives to map the charges. First-degree murder. They bundle the confession, the DNA, the recovery of remains, the church records, the key logs, and the Polaroids into a single narrative that a jury can hold. Intent will be argued in court, but the sequence is tight. The state will present force, abduction, concealment, and the keeping of a trophy as proof of purpose and consciousness of guilt. Hale is moved to the county jail to await arraignment. He drops his eyes when cameras ask if he has anything to say. A church colleague stands outside the fence, stunned. "He told us to keep hoping," she says. "All this time, he knew where she was." Asheville exhales in pain. The wrong men are cleared. The right man is finally named. The silver necklace that once lay warm against a teenager's skin now sits under glass, tagged and sealed. The quiet object that broke a silence of decades. The case is no longer a ghost story. It is dates and places. The prosecution began by laying out the evidence that had finally cracked the case. They showed the silver necklace engraved with the initials E.C., Emily's birthday gift from her mother. They presented the faded Polaroid photos recovered from the old church storage room. And then they revealed the DNA results, an indisputable match to Richard Hale. To strengthen their case, they played recordings of Hale's own confession made during hours of interrogation. The jury listened as Hale described seeing Emily walking alone, offering her a ride, and forcing her into his vehicle when she refused. The courtroom fell silent as those words echoed. For the Carter family, it was devastating, but undeniable confirmation of what had happened that night. The remains of Emily had been found where Hale admitted to leaving them, hidden in the woods behind St. Mary's Church. The dental records matched. After 25 years of uncertainty, there was now truth, brutal, but clear. The prosecution's argument was straightforward. Richard Hale had used his position as a trusted pastor to mask a horrific crime. He had lived as a respected figure in Asheville for decades, while Emily's family and the entire community suffered in the shadow of unanswered questions. The prosecutor called it the deepest betrayal of trust a town can endure. The defense countered with claims that Hale's confession was coerced, that his age and failing health made his words unreliable. They argued that the DNA might have been contaminated or mishandled. They described Hale as a man too old and too frail to stand trial. But the evidence was overwhelming. The DNA was clean. The necklace carried his genetic profile, and the confession aligned with physical proof at the scene. Witnesses took the stand. One of Emily's closest friends recalled how Emily wore her necklace every day, a detail that reinforced the significance of its discovery. A church volunteer testified that Hale had exclusive access to the storage room where the evidence was found. A man who lived near the field back in 1991 recalled hearing a short scream the night Emily disappeared. The Carter family's reaction was immediate and raw. Emily's mother and father wept openly, clinging to one another. Her mother managed to speak after the verdict. "We finally get to bring Emily home." Her brother Michael's words were brief but powerful. "We lived in his shadow, never knowing the truth. Today, that ends." For Brian Collins and Tommy Reed, the verdict was both vindication and torment. For over 2 decades, they had lived under suspicion. Brian, Emily's ex-boyfriend, had lost his future in basketball and lived with the stigma of being the violent boyfriend who everyone assumed was guilty. Now, with the world watching, he said, "I lived as a suspect without a conviction for 24 years. His words hit headlines nationwide, symbolizing the damage caused by false suspicion. Though the community began to apologize, the scars on his life were permanent. Tommy Reed reacted differently. Within days of the trial ending, he left Asheville. Speaking briefly to a reporter before he left, he said, "I can't stay where people looked at me as a killer." For him, vindication had come too late. The mistrust of neighbors, the lost years, the isolation, none of it could be erased. The town itself faced a reckoning. The discovery that a pastor, the man who had led prayers for Emily's safe return, was the very man who killed her, shook Asheville to its core. The St. Mary's congregation collapsed. Many parishioners abandoned the church entirely, unable to reconcile faith with betrayal. The wider community demanded answers from law enforcement. How had a man with direct access to the church storage room never been properly investigated in 1991? The police acknowledged their failures. They admitted that bias, tunnel vision, and over-reliance on suspicion of Brian and Tommy had blinded them. In response, changes were made. The North Carolina Cold Case Unit expanded its staff and received funding to modernize forensic analysis. Officers were trained on evidence preservation, with the lesson of Emily's necklace serving as a constant reminder that even the smallest item could unlock the truth decades later. Word spreads across Asheville. The first news truck is there before the backhoe shuts off. A parishioner stands by the police tape shaking. "He married us," He baptized our son." Another voice breaks in, a longtime choir member. "I thought he was the safest man in town." On the courthouse steps, a retired usher says only one sentence to a reporter. "We let him stand over us and tell us what was right." The mood is shock, followed by anger. The focus turns to those who carried the town's suspicion for decades. Brian Collins takes a call he's waited half his life to receive. The detective explains the DNA results and the confession. He says the department will move to clear Brian officially. Brian exhales, like a tire losing air. "Do you know what it's like to walk into a grocery store and feel every eye?" he asks later on camera. "I didn't do this." "I never did." Tommy Reed hears next. He's older, cautious, slow to trust anyone with a badge. He listens in silence. He asks if this is real. The detective confirms it is. Tommy gives one line to a local paper at his door. "I can go to the diner in daylight now." His relief collides with rage at the time he lost. Inside the church office, detectives seize access logs, maintenance schedules, keys, and archived emails. They reconstruct who held which keys in 1991. Hale's name sits in black ink across the forms. Maintenance notes place him in the storage rooms multiple times in the months after Emily's disappearance. Box inventories are incomplete, but the handwriting matches his. The Polaroids show a path and a tree line at night. They are not graphic, but they are specific. The camera prints were common in the early 90s. The film batch number lines up with purchases made by the church that summer. The State Crime Lab builds the evidentiary chain with care. Each item from the storage room is rebagged with modern labels. Surfaces are photographed with scales. The necklace is re-swabbed at multiple points to confirm the DNA profile and replicate the hit. The Carter family found a measure of peace. They were finally able to lay Emily to rest with dignity, surrounded by hundreds of supporters. Her parents, though marked by years of pain, spoke of using their remaining time to support other families facing cold cases. Michael, her brother, turned his grief into advocacy, volunteering with missing persons organizations and speaking publicly about the dangers of rushing to judgment in investigations. Even society around them shifted in positive ways. The tragedy inspired new policies for evidence storage across the state, annual audits of unsolved cases, and community initiatives to prevent violence. Neighbors who once stayed silent during investigations became more willing to come forward. Schools in Asheville began holding safety awareness programs in Emily's name. Out of a story of loss, real change was born. The trial had ended the silence that haunted Asheville for 25 years. But for the Carter family, and for the two men wrongly accused, the scars would never fully fade. Still, the community had taken steps forward. Trust was harder to give, but vigilance was stronger than before. Emily Carter's name was